Mabingue Ngom, hello, and thank you for traveling from Addis Ababa for my African Hour. The theme of this show is to identify the challenges to capture the demographic dividend in Africa and to offer solutions to take full advantage of this opportunity for economic growth that it represents. So you have long led the regional office for West Africa and Central Africa of the United Nations Fund for the Population, the UNFPA, and you advise its Executive Director, Dr. Natalia Kanem. You are now the Executive Director of the UNFPA to the African Union and the Economic Commission for Africa. So to start off, you, as a trained economist, can you please give us a simple definition of what is the demographic dividend?
The demographic dividend is extremely simple. It's simply a matter of increasing economic growth from which a country can benefit when the population structure is favorable. In other words, it's when the number of people of working age is much more important than the number of people in charge, meaning people under 15 years old and people over the age of 64.
So we're talking about a series of demographic curves which will intersect, mingle. How does it work?
It's a question of optimizing this fringe of the population of working age. This is the first step for a change of structure. But the second thing is that we absolutely must invest in the development of this human capital, first through education, then health, but also job creation. This will allow this fringe of the population to bring an extraordinary contribution to building growth.
So, right now we have news since the African Union that the UNFPA, supported for 20 years, is celebrating this year its 60 years of existence. I'm sure you have a celebration program, I believe. I hope we will have a little bit of the scoop provided for this purpose. Tell me, why does the UNFPA attach so much importance to its partnership with the African Union?
Our partnership with the African Union dates back to more than 2 decades. It's true that the new organization is celebrating its 20th anniversary, which coincides with the 60th since the creation of the Organization of African Unity.
Our strategic plan has 3 priorities. We call it the 3 zeros.
The first zero to ensure that there are no maternal deaths. The second challenge is to ensure that no woman who needs to access family planning services encounters any difficulties. And the third challenge, it's really to get to zero gender-based violence. As you know, it's in Africa that we have the toughest challenges in maternal mortality. To this, I can add that we have 6 regional offices around the world, and 3 are in Africa, and more half of our programs in terms of budget, in terms of portfolio, are also found in Africa. So Africa is a continent among 5 continents, but it concentrates more than half of our programs. It's also the epicenter of the big problems where the UNFPA works.
All right. So this partnership with the African Union goes beyond coordination effort. It's something really that allows you really be present across the continent, if I understand correctly.
Yes, I even believe beyond the continent. 10 days ago, I had a great meeting with the Brazilian ambassador in Addis Ababa to see how we can strengthen South-South cooperation between Africa and Brazil. The same with India. I also met the ambassador of India for the African Union, and we're seeing how to make India give more support to African countries, but also the African Union as an organization in the acceleration of leading Africa towards our prosperity.
The capture of the demographic dividend is a crucial subject for the 54 African states. You have just told us, given the youth of their population, 60% of young Africans are under 25 years old. But far from being a weakness, this resource could, on the contrary, pay off by 2050, when the number of young workers will be greater than the number of inactives. Hence my first question, what is at stake here is a good acceleration of economic growth, so that the continent can take off by 2050 by capitalizing on this famous demographic dividend. But to make sure that it does not remain a view of the mind, there are a number of preconditions, starting with a decline in fertility. Are you hopeful at this point that the inversion of the curve between active and inactive may well happen on a continent scale?
The issue of capture of the demographic dividend goes beyond growth gains. Because if we miss the mark, we'll see spread across the continent some phenomena we see today in the Sahel region or in the Lake Chad basin. The social demand that is not satisfied is a factor of fragility and even instability. I believe there are some positive aspects that we can gain by investing in the demographic dividend. There are also extremely high costs that we risk paying if we don't invest enough in young people.
I suggest now we go to Dakar, your city in the commune of Gueule-Tapée-Fass-Colobane, which was one of the linchpins for the realization of the project Fass Emergent. This is an exclusive report made for My African Hour by Mamadou Dieng of ITV in Senegal. Let's watch.
Fass Emergent, this innovative project translated concretely the inclusion of populations, in particular young people and women, in the municipality district of Fass, Gueule-Tapée-Colobane. Thanks to UNFPA, the United Nations Fund for the Population, this town, located in the heart of the Senegalese capital, served as a test for the implementation of public policies associated with Act 3 of decentralization, but also to international initiatives. 5 years later, the town hall draws a satisfactory balance sheet. Yes, very satisfied. Talking about these results would amount to answering the question of saying how to explain the emerging interest of Fass. We remember that it is the centrality SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, in its achievements of Fass. Among the achievements of the project, a brand new health post fully equipped, the board office, ADA for teenagers, or a one-stop shop. This office serves as advice and guidance in terms of employability through training and support for entrepreneurship, but also support and capacity building to facilitate the empowerment of young people and women of the said commune. The implementation of an integrated strategy for economic and social development has had a positive impact for the emergence of this municipality, which represents Dakar in miniature. Fass is really Senegal in miniature. It's one of the poorest neighborhoods, and today we're putting Fass out of the hole to rise to the levels of others. Housemates sleep in Fass, students sleep in Fass, because the University of Dakar is 300 meters from Fass. However, many challenges remain to truly reduce poverty. The major challenges: invest in early childhood. We must also invest in empowerment of women and youth. It's fundamental. By accompanying them to set up advanced programs to be able to market what they're producing or understanding the business ecosystem. It's a good lever to help these young people develop on the economic plan. FAS-E, a pilot initiative for the implementation of the demographic dividend, which currently inspires other communes in Senegal, while waiting to be exported to the countries of the sub-region, even beyond Africa.
So, a first reaction?
In my opinion, as an architect of this initiative, I'm happy to see that the dynamic has started. Beyond the physical aspects that we've seen, the questions of infrastructures that have been settled, the fact that we were able to bring to the level a bit of the land, the most urgent services which the FASWA needed. Maybe it's the fact that we were able to organize or facilitate community mobilization.
The purpose of SE was to reduce poverty. 5 years later, has this goal been achieved?
I can't say that the goal is completely achieved, but I will say very important progress has now been made. It is this partnership approach which allowed FAS to be selected as the best example of partnership at the level of the United Nations.
Precisely. The interest of this project, as you presented it, was that normally it had to emulate. The report says a little in other communes of Senegal, but even beyond. Was that the case?
We had to test a model. It had to be developed. It needed to be optimized and make it a path which can speed up Africa's march to prosperity. To go beyond Senegal, West and Central Africa, and maybe even beyond Africa itself. And I think that's luck.
Some countries have already
I
started.
was thinking in particular of Guinea. In Mali, there were 7 and 3, their association had 7 and 3 mayors from a neighboring country extremely interested to the duplication of the FAS project. In Chad, in Niger and in other countries, including in Guinea-Bissau.
Capturing the demographic dividend is complex because, besides economic growth, it assumes that a country can make substantial gains in terms of child survival, girls' education, inclusion, or political stability. As you said, there are certainly public policies which can be reoriented, but very often the budgets of African states are limited, not to say inexistent. So how do you do it at UNFPA to convince them to invest in programs that will enable them to capitalize on their demographic transition, which you point out is a necessary step towards achieving development goals?
Yes, I believe that the resource issue is extremely important. But I believe that the question of good policy is even more important. I always say money doesn't guarantee development, but it is important. I think an indicator is to see that in some countries we should aim for 15% of expenses. As far as health is concerned, and unfortunately in countries like Mali, President IBK told me in 2019 that there were practically around 5%. Because naturally, if you have security expenses which exceed 15, 20 or 30%, you can't adequately finance education, you can't properly fund health, and you can't even accompany job creation operations. So we come to a situation where you have increasing social demand because the population has doubled. So I think you must find the means to support development efforts accentuating on these important sites, such as the demographic dividend that will allow, for example, in Africa south of the Sahara, to have around $500 billion per year for 30 years.
So that's what's needed, $500 billion.
$500 billion. That's what Africa can win every year for at least 30 years. Before the end of 2017, most African countries had launched their roadmap. And I must pay tribute to the African heads of states who had moreover personally assumed the leadership of this extremely important project. We launched the SWED, and I think since then we feel profound transformations at the level of the first 6 countries. Afterwards, we have expanded to 3 more countries, and as I speak, we're about to welcome a group slightly larger than 2 countries. I think the momentum is on, and it's interesting because the First Ladies in 2018 had requested that by signing a paper asking that this program, which really touched the girls, women and young people, may be widespread across the continent.
Exactly. I now suggest we go to Cameroon. This country has joined the SWED program, which allowed it to achieve significant progress in empowerment for women and promotion of the demographic dividend. However, there is still a lot to do to improve access to education for young girls. The report we offer was made for My African Hour by Oswald Medong of Cameroon National Television. Let's have a look.
Ensuring equitable and quality access to young girls and boys. It's been a few years ago now that Cameroon has made it a priority, thanks to the law of 2001 who made access to education free for public establishments, as well as the creation of areas of priority education in the ZEPs. The school enrollment rate increased from 60 to 100% over the past 5 years. Despite these good results, the site remains in particular at secondary level, which has a high dropout rate. As it concerns the schooling of girls, the policies that have been put in place for gender promotion just have to keep going, and the various stakeholders to be engaged with the action development partners. Many things have been done. We, even young people, we are committed to this action to make women understand that the empowerment of women is a base to have a strong enough family. Between early marriages and unwanted pregnancies, there are plenty of reasons to explain the greatest dropouts of girls. 13% of young Cameroonians are married before the age of 13 and 38% before they turn 18. But it's not impossible to change the situation.
We've gotten closer to populations, communities, schools and others as a matter of involving everyone and bring parents to understand the good in taking interest in girls' education. Currently, we are working on what we call a SWED project, which is much more focused on schooling of the young girl in the Sahel, since it is this area which so far is lagging behind.
In 2018, Cameroon joined the SWED program for the empowerment of women and the demographic dividend in the Sahel. Since then, the country has achieved significant progress in monitoring sustainable development goals set by the UN within the framework of the 2030 Agenda. Reducing the gap between the number of boys and girls educated is not left out.
It's one of the goals that has evolved the best. We get to have a good enrollment rate in primary school, but we notice that adolescence is the most fragile. The fight against violence is one of the issues that take more time to see progress because we do encourage, we do provide quality services, we do work on changing social norms, we do work on denunciation and repression with all the ministries concerned to really be able to offer a package full of activities that will be of great help.
In addition to gender-based violence, the socio-political crisis which prevails in the northern regions and southwest Cameroon. Despite everything, the constant figures in progress remain encouraging, which proves the country is on the right track. My first reaction is really a reaction of satisfaction. To see how we supported Cameroon to define its dividend profile population in 2015. This is an important step, not just the product went out, but the way we worked with Cameroonians themselves. This is development, and I believe that's what we do across Africa and around the world. We create the conditions to improve the situation of the populations. We answer to the requests of people. We accompany them, and better, we facilitate the massive arrival of other partners to accelerate the march towards progress.
And access to formal jobs.
Formal and even informal. As I speak, I know that the Secretariat in charge of operations of the Free Zone Exchange is working to ensure that young people can have access to these financial resources, which will allow them to climb or even enlarge existing businesses. And I think it's an opportunity to be welcomed.
So now we're going to Niger, a country that is dear to your heart because you have worked hard for it. Well, you are right to involve the customary and religious leaders, since Niger is considered today as one of the leading countries in the implementation of the SWED. And it comes a long way. Significant progress was thus recorded in the reduction of maternal and infant mortality, promoting empowerment for women and girls, improving access to services such as health and family planning. But of course, there is still ancestral prejudice, as well as harmful practices for the health of women and girls. The Spotlight program, which has just ended 2019 to 2022, enabled Niger to fight against gender-based violence. What were the repercussions? I invite you to discover this report made in Niamey for My Africa Time by Moussa Moody of UNFPA television. Let's listen to it.
In Niger, the considerable efforts made to fight against gender-based violence have enabled this country, coming from afar, to come closer to the development goals included in the 2030 agenda of the UN. With a population estimated at 22 million inhabitants, Niger is a Sahelian country where women have an average of 6.2 children. Additionally, 65% of older girls, 20 to 24 years old, marry before the age of 18. Launched 4 years ago in 8 African countries by UNFPA, the initiative Spotlight aims to eliminate all forms of violence towards women and girls, a way to promote their autonomy and therefore the capture of the demographic dividend. As for the Spotlight program, there have been huge changes which concern not only social life, women and girls, but these changes will have a long-term impact on the country's economy, but also on the well-being of all communities, men and women. The Regional Empowerment Project of Women and the Demographic Dividend in the Sahel benefits of the support from UNFPA to achieve Spotlight goals. Its coordinator evokes with much satisfaction major advances made thanks to this initiative. 85% of the target has been achieved, whether at the level of boys or girls. The same is true regarding the girls who have been trained, for example, on questions of hygiene, period, women's rights, and self-esteem for women. And also responsibility. Through a newly created listening centre in Zinda, among the 4 available to the country, the president of the NGO Women and Children Victims of Domestic Violence does not hide his pride. Within a few years, this organization contributed to change positively the lives of many women and girls victims of domestic violence.
In terms of results, we have registered 256 cases of survivors of gender-based violence. Among them, there are women and girls, rape victims, sexual harassment, early or forced marriages, and cases of abductions too.
But nothing would have been possible without the involvement of customary leaders to fight against gender-based violence. After a first phase awareness campaign in 300 villages of the 4 regions with the highest prevalence rate, actions continued in the other 4 regions. In total, there are 120 municipalities and 600 villages which have thus been able to participate, to the great satisfaction of authorities, but also women and girls involved.
Well, I don't know what you think, but it's impressive, the number of villages sensitized to the notorious gender-based violence.
Yes, it's very satisfying. It's impressive. I know that in the case of Niger, the traditional chiefdom is much more influential and much more powerful than religious leaders. So their mobilization, their support, their leadership, their support constitute, in my opinion, the most important achievement, the most viable, the most durable. It's the one that will transform in the long term the situation of girls and women in Niger.
Yes, and then women are finally heard. Their word is legitimate.
We have great initiatives which come from Niger. like the school for husbands.
Did you say the school for husbands?
Yes, the school for husbands, which consists to have an attitude much more positive in men to change women's lives. I said, moreover, in Dakar last year on the occasion of the Summit on Positive Masculinity, that the woman's life will not change, that when we men will change our attitude towards our daughter, our mother, or our wife, or our sister. And it's also an area where we work with heads of state and government to add this additional touch for the transformation of Africa.
We are coming to the end of this first part of My African Hour, but above all, stay tuned because we are coming back with even more revelations on this famous demographic dividend in the second part. See you soon. My African Hour continues with our distinguished guest, Mr. Mabingue Ngom. He's the special advisor to the executive director of the Fund of the United Nations for the Population, Dr. Natalia Lam, and heads the UNFPA office to the African Union and the Economic Commission for Africa. In the first part of the show, we discussed some major challenges that Africa has to overcome in order to capture its demographic dividend, which refers, need I remind you, to the accelerated economic growth period, which may result from a rapid decline of fertility and mortality rates, with as a consequence an increase of the labor force relative to the total population. That's the theory. But in practice, as we have seen, there are many obstacles among all these intolerable challenges. What are the ones which seem to you the best curbed?
We have to speed up the demographic transition that I would like to define as a drop in mortality and fertility rates. I think there is a drop in the general mortality rate, but I think the drop in fertility drags on a bit, and above all, in Africa south of the Sahara. Within the countries that make up Africa south of the Sahara, I think the dynamics are not identical. We have to make sure that countries accelerate this transition. These investments, which are essential to improve the condition of our human capital, it's important. Also, massive investments have to be made in education, in training, but also in health matters, as well as a general improvement in public policies, which is why African countries must not only work to accelerate their transition, but they also have to face education expenses that will ensure that human capital improves and that there may be additional productivity, which in turn will drive growth.
Of all these challenges that we looked at previously, which for you seems to be the most in progression today on the continent?
The most in progress, I would say, the decline in neonatal infant mortality.
So their progress has been made.
Well, I think there is progress being made in maternal mortality. Now is the time to make a call. We went, for example, from a death rate of 676 per 100,000 births to an increase to 717, which is still very serious, between 2015 and 2022. As we witness an accelerated decrease in some parts of the world, in West and Central Africa, maternal mortality has increased. Of course, resources are needed. But what we need more of is good coordination or replication of successful practices. Partners working hand in hand, countries going much faster, so that they can in any case be much more efficient in this fight to save the woman who gives life.
Absolutely, a good fight. I would like now to introduce you to my first expert. He heads the African department of IFRI, the French Institute of International Relations that you know well. He would just like to ask you a question on the example of Asian countries who have already been able to take advantage of their demographic dividend, some for many years, by the way, which allowed them especially to industrialize. Let's hear him.
Hello, my name is Alain Antil. I'm the head of the African Center of the French Institute of International Relations. Regarding the question of the demographic dividend, there's a lot of confusion. Some people in Africa have not hesitated to say, speaking of the sub-Saharan Africa, that a massive increase of population was synonymous with a demographic dividend, while this concept is more complex. And in order to get to a demographic dividend, certain conditions are required. So the questions I wanted to ask you is first, why do some Asian countries, since the 70s and 80s, such as China, India, Vietnam and others, have been able to use or capture the demographic dividend to their benefit? That is to say, at the same time, this demographic boom, but also the necessary measures that go with it, which Africa did not do, while facing nevertheless standards of living roughly equivalent after the Second World War, or even independence in the early 1960s. And how can Africa be inspired by the Asian model or Asian models to catch up this gap and finally get in on emergence trajectories? Thank you. Alain's question is very relevant. But I believe that the realities are different. And I believe that the Asian experience is relevant, even if in Asia it is not homogeneous. I think that the particularity of Africa is that we have phenomena such as child marriage, which makes the transformation of the age pyramid difficult. We also have the multiple conflicts facing Africa, and which do not favor continuous access to the health system, maternity, services, and others. Plus, we also have other factors which are specific to Africa that were not necessarily met in Asian countries. Naturally, and I think that's where I'm going to insist, the fiscal space is not available in countries such as the countries of the Sahel or countries of the Great Lakes region facing safety issues, which means that they have to put a good part of their resources in the war and security effort. And so, I think all things being equal, perhaps it is indeed an international cooperation, a much more militant international solidarity that can speed up the demographic dividend map. And the last point is that the partnership approach hasn't always been the best, which means that there's an impressive number of small-scale operations.
One word is yet to be uttered in this issue, and that is the investment in family planning. Maybe that's one of the keys precisely for the capture of this demographic dividend.
Yes, I don't think it's a must that a woman has access to family planning services, which allows her to decide when she wants a child and when she doesn't want to. It's fundamental, and at the UNFPA, we insist that this choice be made freely. We don't want to interfere at this level, and we think that it's a question of law, therefore of choice, for which we don't want to interfere. But that being said, it must be recognized that the decision to make a child has huge consequences on public policies. The decision to have a child is a private decision, but we must remember that the state finances, public services and even partners' development aids are not enough to build these thousands of classrooms. There's thousands of hospital beds, these spaces. I think there needs to be a balance. And the number that I often give is that 55% of children aged between 6 and 14 in the Central Sahel region do not go to school. 55%. You can see what it means for building the Africa we want by 2063.
Of course. Let's now talk about external challenges threatening Africa, and we know how numerous they are. My second expert runs the Club du Sahel for OECD West Africa. Let's hear him.
Hello, Mr. Ngom. I'm happy to be part of this show by your side, even virtually. My name is Laurent Bossard. I'm the director of the Club du Sahel for OECD West Africa. As far as the population, I say with great force that what is happening in tropical Africa, West Africa more specifically, is unparalleled in human history. The region will have finally taken 35 years to double its population. It took 2 centuries for Europe between the 18th and the 19th century, and as for Asia, it will have taken 70 years. So it's a phenomenon of extraordinary power which generates a very large number of imbalances. And these imbalances are exacerbated by exogenous imbalances, such as climate change, the various and varied pandemics, economic crises like the war in Ukraine, etc. And deep down, I think the story will remember that tropical Africa will have been the only region of the world to have to face at the same time simultaneously its demographic transition, its integration into the global economy, and its climate transition. Besides, Africa will not be able to appeal, as did all other regions of the world, to the massive emigration to ease its population growth. Europe did it, Asia did it. So the challenges are endogenous and complicated, exogenous and unpredictable. They're huge, and Africa must face them with very, very little financial means. Very, very little. Basically, Africa is in globalization problems, but not enough in the globalization of solutions. For example, it does not have access, or very, very little, to climate finance, which is approaching $100 billion per year. So here I have 2 questions to submit, if you allow it. The first is how to mobilize a lot more resources and endogenous initiatives, knowing that most states will remain poor, are and will remain poor. And the second question, this is how to bring in Africa in the globalization of solutions, in particular give him access to financial resources internationally. Thank you. Well, I would say that Laurent Bossard touched on point 2 questions of capital importance. First of all, he spoke of the daunting challenges Africa is facing. climate change, population growth, but also some shocks, exogenous, such as pandemics, or even the results of certain geopolitical difficulties. With the crisis in Ukraine, which, moreover, whether we like it or not, Africa's problems are less and less important. I think we have to accept it. And during the time of COVID, we also felt that international solidarity was lacking. I think it makes the current situation in Africa much more difficult. The second thing which you mentioned is the promise of $100 billion for the climate. Promises are not always the appointment. If the international community accompanies Africa in its choice, in its will to capture the demographic dividend, but we can have every year more than the total envelope, SDRs, and even if you add special drawing rights on the 3, 4 or 5, and you add the 100 billion per year, but it's an infinitely small in front of what Africa can draw by investing in the demographic dividend. Again, I'm talking about a financial windfall that I estimated 8-10 years ago to 500 billion per year over 30 years.
That can only be fallouts from initial investments.
Yes, but you have to make that investment.
Because these investments have to be initially made.
And I must salute our partnership with the World Bank to support the SWED countries. For 6-7 years old of the SWED, we barely mobilized 1 billion. So you imagine the transformations that are underway. If, for example, we had invested 20, 50 or $100 billion in the capture of the dividend demographic, certainly Africa could have done without SDRs, maybe even climate investments. What is happening in Africa would affect first our neighbors in Europe. I think it's inevitable. And after Europe, it would affect others. So I think we're on board in the same company, in the same step towards prosperity for all. And I don't think we can have a prosperous world while there is an Africa that is not prosperous.
So, in this regard, precisely, you agree with what Laurent Bossard advocates. That's to say, a globalization of solutions. And I picked up for my part, you must have also fallen to ease, this famous immigration vow that Africa is also being denied. This globalization of solutions, how would you envision it?
I think we have to appreciate the positive aspects. But there are also challenges, because as far as I know, immigration has contributed to improve the job situation in certain specific sectors, but not all the way. I spoke earlier about the 55% young people from the Sahel who do not go to school. They can't shoot benefit from this form of immigration. I think it's complex. Should we encourage the few brains that we have at the level of Africa to leave? To strengthen the desert knowledge and leave only maybe the 55% who can't enjoy this lead Africa? I think that's not in the spirit of Africa that we want. We must ensure that the migration may have beneficial effects.
Among the most significant external challenges in Africa you alluded to on several occasions, there is of course insecurity due to armed conflict. One of the indicators to measure the benefits of the demographic dividend in terms of improving governance is moreover the absence of conflicts for 5 years. I offer you a testimonial on the activity of an NGO that you know well. Since it's Plan International, like the UNFPA, it works for the inclusion of girls, especially in a region that is very at risk today, namely the Lake Chad Basin. Let's hear it. Hello, my name is Diane Richard. I currently work for the NGO Plan International France, an organization committed to fighting for children's rights and equality between girls and boys. As you very well know, Plan International is active in the Lake Chad region because in this context of the crisis within the area, girls and women face relentless sexist and sexual violence, including kidnappings and arranged marriages. Plan International provides emergency humanitarian aid as well as long-term help centered mainly on childhood protection and emancipation, the emancipation of girls. Plan International work in the Lake Chad region will ultimately affect more than 350,000 people across 3 countries in the years to come. So here we have an interesting testimony because humanitarian work in times of crisis is complicated. Can you explain to us how African countries intend to get organized to fight against this scourge? And I don't think I'm revealing any secrets, but it's common knowledge that you are very involved in the new humanitarian agency that the African Union has started to set up. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Yes. First, thanks our colleagues of Plan International for what they're doing in a difficult region, a crisis-affected region, where the question of access to basic services that are education, health, protection are among the priority actions. I think that our colleagues in the field must work more together to ensure some complementarity and maybe even synergies, which are essential. Regarding current actions at the level of the African Union, in particular the establishment of the African Humanitarian Agency, I must say that progress is good. From Kampala in 1929, passing by last year's Malabo summit, I think it was May 27, from last year, where we attended with extraordinary momentum, where the highest African authorities have mobilized, and they released approximately $176 billion to start the operations of the agency. It's a salutary momentum, a noble impulse, even if the resources mobilized are very far to approach the minimum amount that we need to extinguish all sources of tension that we have in Africa. In fact, 75% of humanitarian action globally is taking place in Africa.
I also find that the budget is very small.
And unfortunately, of that $174 million, less than 1% are actually in the accounts banks of the African Union. So I think it's a huge challenge. First of all, there are risks to further delay the establishment of the agency. There are risks regarding the mobilization of other actors who were hesitant in Malabo. But I must also salute the determination of Africans who went to the conference of Istanbul in 2016. The Africans still marked a bit of leadership, coming up with a common position who defines their vision. And it is this vision that is behind setting up the agency. This is what must be completed. We must therefore translate these political decisions that dream to have an agency that will have 2 roles. The first is to strengthen coordination of humanitarian action in Africa. And the second role is to enhance the efficiency of humanitarian action. We know that independent works show that every day Africa loses around 1,000 people through the crisis. So it's not about fanciful building sites. But it's to save human lives. And I believe that on the occasion, 60 years anniversary of the Continental Organization, the greatest gift that we can give to Africa, it's really to speed up the establishment of this agency.
Well, we wish fair wind to this agency, and it will have indeed a lot of work, sure.
Lots of things to do, yes.
Yes, absolutely. We have now reached the end of the show, and of course, we have to end it with the rather annoying question of our section, Du piment sur la tchéké, a francophone African version of thorn in the side. Is there too much population or not enough population in Africa? So, we often have the vision seen from the West, overcrowded slums, major African cities, and maybe not enough that of the rural immensities where the nomadic population is very scattered. In turn, this is perhaps the greatest challenge in capturing the demographic dividend in Africa, ensuring that, despite the disparities in population, everyone can benefit from public policies most suited to their needs. So, does this dream to you seem attainable today?
First, I will say that this dream is feasible. It depends on where we put available resources. I think it also depends on the state of international solidarity. It also depends on the choices. It's a question of choice. I keep thinking that this dream is achievable, that it can be achievable in the future and not too far. The number of seizures increases, the number of people affected increases. The money we put to resolve these crises increases. Financing gaps increase. So it's like the snake biting its own tail. Africans can't do it alone, despite their goodwill. You need strong support of the international community. This international solidarity is essential for the future of humanity.
And on these fine words, dear Mr. Mabingue Ngom, thank you for being the guest of My African Hour.
Thank you.